do that. Okay, she's just told me recording in progress.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'll just briefly introduce you. So I'm very happy and very delighted to be joined by Ron White, who I have now known for well over 20 years, because 20 years ago was the first Iddleton, which Ron was the lead trainer on, and Ron and I were involved in the team that designed basically the curriculum and the assessment of the course. So we just began chatting, but I thought I will start recording it. So Ron, you were saying that something about the history of where it came from. It came from something called the Addleton, really. That was the previous course.
Yeah, and I was involved in that. I think there was an examining board which had sort of oversight of Addleton, and so that's how my sort of commitment to Iddleton evolved. Plus, I was on this other committee, which was the sort of committee of committees, and it was at that committee that Uckles announced that they were going to basically retire Addleton, and it was then that that Donald and Christine said, no, this mustn't happen. This is a worthwhile qualification. There is a need for it. And they negotiated pretty well on the spot. The initial negotiations were to revive it, but with a new name and 3 owners. And that in itself was new, because although Uckles were going, as they were then, they've renamed and rebranded and reinvented themselves
since then, I think.
Yeah, several times. But they were one of the idea of a sort of joint ownership was in itself a novelty, but it was Uckles who awarded the certificate. They were the if you like, the degree awarding body, and Uckles has never been, and I suppose never will be, a delivery body. They were a validation and awarding body. So SIT and ICE-T became the delivery bodies, as it were. And so the first course, of course, was the one that you and I taught at SIT, and we finished it, as I recall, in Lviv. Is that right?
Indeed, yeah. So with the first course started on October 1st in Vermont in the US at the School for International Training, SIT. And then we had 2 weeks face-to-face, followed by about 7 or 8 months online, followed by a weekend, like a long weekend in Lviv, where everybody came for the second part of the course for this long weekend, including the 2 participants from Central America, because we had someone from Costa Rica and someone from Panama, all the way to Ukraine to take this long weekend, which involved
simulation, wasn't it? So, didn't we do a simulation?
We had a simulation, it was a simulation,
yeah.
But we basically, so we sort of hosted a simulation for them to which actually all the other subsequent courses had a simulation at the end as well. It's just most of the time they did it online, so we had a very good time in Lviv, and had this simulation and significant quantities of vodka, as I recall, in the evenings.
Yes, it was. Yes,
it was a very, very enjoyable
definitely
first experience.
A spirited end to the course. Yes.
I mean, I'll just fill in a couple of those names that you mentioned. So the two other people who with Ron were sort of originally kind of pushed this thing to happen were Donald Freeman from SIT, who was my boss at the time, and Christine Bunderson from ICE-T, which was an arm of the University of Queensland. So Donald and Christine were on this committee with Ron, and then a group of us, Ron and me from SIT, and Stephen Heap, who's still involved in Iddleton with me from Queensland, and Elaine Brown from Uckles, were the 4 people who put together this curriculum and assessment, I remember. But yeah.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it was actually really quite exciting, because we were having to rethink something that in itself was quite new. And we did, as I recall, more or less say, well, we're not just going to kind of tinker around with the old model, we'll start afresh. And it was to be essentially a series of modules with kind of mixed mode delivery, with the initial 2 weeks and then the online. And this, of course, was well, for us anyway, was
it was
the early
new. I mean, for me, it was
online.
the first time I worked in that way at all. Completely.
Yeah. I mean, I had experience of this with the MA TEFL at Reading, which had a sort of, in a sense, a sort of similar genesis in that we started off with a clean blackboard, as it were, or whiteboard as it should be now, and we'd sort of thought, well, you know, what should a MA TEFL consist of? What content should it have? How should this be organized? We decided that it should be modular. And again, we had this sort of mixed mode with an initial period of face-to-face teaching, followed by what was then a very primitive form of online teaching. I mean, you know, when you think now of what facilities are available for online teaching, as we are now, I mean, this face-to-face discussion now was then pretty well impossible.
20 years
the
ago,
technology just didn't exist. So in a way, so there was my experience of the MA TEFL. There was our decision, our agreement that we needed to sort of start afresh with Iddleton. And then the sort of evolution of what I think has become a more common kind of model, where you've got a combination of face-to-face and distance. And I think that face-to-face, that combination with initial face-to-face, where everybody gets to know each other, that's so important. The sort of, you know, the development, the camaraderie and so on, because it means that the distance learning, that everybody knows who they're dealing with. I mean, and you've already, you know, developed a sort of social group. And of course, when it comes to the final simulation, that's particularly important, that people are kind of used to communicating with each other, working together. I think the simulation, which was actually quite difficult to create, and I mean, it was really quite challenging, and it went through a number of iterations. I don't know what state it's in now, but
you know, about 5 out there that I've been using. So there's your simulations. I remember one of your simulations, it was in Brisbane, and one of your simulations was in Prague. But there's other ones I've used. There's one in Vietnam, and there's one in Thailand, and there's one somewhere else. As I've worked in different places, come up with a new simulation based on your model, actually. So I mean, I've sort of used your model and changed it around and stuck different things. It's always one of those things from time to time is like to run an imaginary language school and put all the figures in so that the students can work with the figures. And I think it's just what kind of weird life am I leading, that I'm basically running this imaginary language school, and this year's been a bad year, we didn't get very many students and so on.
And actually doing all the figures I found was the most challenging part, because the figures had to sort of fit in with whatever the scenario was that you were developing, and they had to. And I mean, initially, I certainly made a number of errors in creating the figures, but which one or two of the sharper people were able to point out. But I mean, it was actually it was fun to do in a way. It was quite. I mean, it was definitely quite challenging, but it was fun to kind of create this imaginary world of a language school, and then from year to year, or from course to course, having to evolve it as well. Because you couldn't just, you'd have to try and incorporate in each successive iteration something that was responding to developments which were occurring. or that had, you could learn from one iteration to another. You would know, well, next time I run it, I'll need to change this or that, and generally tinker around with it.
No, do you remember that? I mean, I don't know if you remember about, I don't know when it was, about probably as many as 10 years ago, maybe sort of like 6 or 7 years ago. There were those terrible floods in Brisbane. I don't know if you remember this. I remember writing those into the simulation for the Brisbane school because the school that you had created was in Toowong in Brisbane, and the water came up in Toowong. So the school had been affected by the floods. So all of these things happened. So I mean, I haven't actually had to rewrite these since the pandemic started. So that will be an interesting thing the next time I have to.
Yes. Well, of course, I suppose with the pandemic, will there be a language school to write about?
Well, yeah, we have to be in a different place.
So,
they always see out the crises, though, this language school. It always does well.
Oh, absolutely. It's immortal. I was thinking too of the people who've been on the course. I mean, you think of the first one, of the diverse people that we had from different hemispheres, totally different backgrounds and experience. But one of the things I do remember from the first group was that there were a number of participants from former Eastern Bloc countries. Yeah. And if you remember, of course, this was within weeks of 9/11. And the media in America and the USA was completely dominated by the raking over of 9/11. I remember myself being very sort of uneasy with the sort of coverage of 9/11 in the American media. I mean, it seemed to me to be, well, among other things, very jingoistic. And I remember one morning at coffee break, we were standing around sort of, chatting. And one of the participants, might have been Mariana, said, commenting on the test, she said, "Isn't this propaganda?" And we all looked at each other and said, yes, because of course they knew propaganda. They recognized
they grew up with it.
That those of us from the free democracies were perhaps rather naive about. But I thought that absolutely summed it up, that what we were experiencing was propaganda on a really rather frightening level.
I mean, by that time it was 3 weeks after 9/11, and by that time it was already the rush to war in Afghanistan, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So, which obviously now has turned full circle, since in the last few months. So
yeah. And there was this there were American flags everywhere.
Yeah,
absolutely everywhere. I mean, every shop had an American flag. It just, I personally found it all rather creepy, but it was also somewhat frightening to see how the country was responding. And the only sort of intelligent discussion or analysis of this was the odd occasion when I heard, would it be public radio or something, public PBS or something?
Maybe, NPR, public radio, or the public TV. PBS was the TV.
And there was an attempt to seriously to consider, to question it, and whereas the rest of it was just this sort of very sort of jingoistic and really very, as I said, rather creepy response to it. But I mean, back to our participants, a tremendous range of people, but such nice people. I mean, there some really terrific people have followed the course, and it's been very rewarding to teach them. Well, I mean, when I say teach, I always felt that I was learning a lot from them, actually. And they of course, were learning a lot from each other as well. I thought
absolutely.
that was.
I think that's one of the beauties of the course, actually, the fact that, it's given people a chance to share ideas with their peers or people who are doing something similar to them.
Yeah.
And I've always felt like you, that I'm sort of like, I'm standing there and sort of acting as a channel for information rather than actually, I'm just kind of helping information flow in some ways.
Yeah. And I think that the structure of the course actually facilitated that. And particularly once the sort of online part of the course evolved, and as technology evolved and gave more opportunities for parallel discussion, I think that meant that there was an opportunity for a lot more sort of interchange. I mean, when I think of the first courses where we were trying to set up discussions across time zones, and I mean maximally different time zones, possibly time zones. And I mean, I don't know how it's evolved in its most recent forms, and the extent to which such discussion is now enabled to be face-to-face. I mean, like now with Zoom. Have you been using Zoom or its equivalent?
Not before. I mean, we will be in the new version of the course, because obviously we're likely to have a course which doesn't have a face-to-face component. The face-to-face component will be like this, like we're now, where face-to-face happens to be through a computer screen because of the situation. We've had a few sort of places where we've had the chance to kind of to talk, and it's got better over the years. I mean, I remember being in courses where the early years, where if we managed to arrange a synchronous meeting with everybody, it would be in text. If you remember, I don't know if you remember that. It wasn't there was no video and there was no audio. It was just people typing.
Yeah.
Which, now I think about it, I think, God, how did we manage that? How did people cope with that? But this is so much easier now that what we have now, the options that we have now. That
yes, and it I think it will also help in the sense of people not feeling isolated. And I think that is always the problem once you've got a dispersed group of people, is that sense of being isolated. Whereas with this kind of face-to-face opportunity, it does break that down. Well, I mean, considering how we've run the course, or how we ran the course for when I was involved with it, what sort of changes do you think have happened, perhaps by evolution rather than revolution? I mean, if you think of the difference between Addletown and Iddletown, that was a real step change. Whereas what sort of, I mean, we've already mentioned to some extent the changes that have taken place, because our original discussion, synchronous discussion, was text-based, so you needed to be a pretty quick typist to be able to sort of keep up with the flow. But what other sorts of evolutionary changes do you think have happened?
Well, there've been a few, although probably I suspect possibly related to the longevity of the course, that maybe not as many as until this point, and not as many as they maybe could have been. I mean, there's a few videos now which we didn't have to begin with. I mean, people didn't have the bandwidth to download videos or watch videos. It was all basically, at the beginning, it was all articles and text-based discussion. Online part. Now there's a slight more variation. There are more things, but one of the things that Steve and I have been looking at in kind of like rethinking about the course is, okay, it doesn't actually no longer seems very modern at all, and we need to do some other things that kind of so one of the things we'll be doing is recording some videos and having more face-to-face like this, not face to face, but whatever this is called, synchronous
Yeah.
discussions.
Yeah.
Of this format for students, and using other tools that we previously hadn't used. I mean, in some ways, we've been able to change things slightly by using whatever platform the various host centers have used. So we've used Blackboard mostly because that's what SIT and University of Queensland both had as their platform, if I remember correctly. I mean, University of Queensland definitely had that, but I think SIT had Blackboard too, an early version of Blackboard. And obviously, as that platform's changed, more options have become available, so we'll be able to do things slightly differently. But we also use Moodle in some courses. I think in Barcelona that we did a lot of courses in Barcelona.
We did, too. Yeah.
And I think that was on Moodle, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So we have used different sort of options, but of course those things almost now, I mean, something like Moodle almost seems old now, given other things that are out there. I mean, Moodle's open source, so it's constantly growing, but
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, one of the big change that happened just after you left the course, I think, not long after you were no longer on the course, was that we took the face-to-face down from 2 weeks to 1 week. So we moved, and because of for sort of in order to make it easier for people to come, because obviously 2 weeks 2 weeks of people's time away from a management job is difficult, plus 2 weeks of hotel accommodation or whatever they needed to became challenging financially. So we changed it down to one week, which was a significant change actually.
But what about, have there been any content changes? Because
in the sense of
years, you would expect there might be some
content has changed. You know what I mean? So I mean, there's much more stuff about e-learning and so on, which of course wasn't in the original course because we didn't much part of the industry that worried about that. Beyond that, I would say that the content change is really to do with the theory change, if you like. So organizational theory has changed somewhat over the years, and what was when we first started the course, maybe the learning organization and stuff maybe was one of the new up and coming things, and now we may be talking more about agile organizations and this kind of shadow organizations and so on. So if you like, the theory's changed because it does.
Well, it changes. Yeah,
we're feeding that into things, and we're learning new things about human resource management in whatever form, and different ways of doing performance management and so on. But actually, if I had to say, I would say that the content has changed for me as one of the trainers, is changed from learning from the students. So as the participants tell me things, oh, this is what we've been doing, this goes into my kind of some sort of bank inside here, which then comes out in the next course. And I say, oh, one of the students on the previous course said this, and this is how they've been doing, and this sort of spreads out in that way.
Yeah. Yes, that's it. It's yes, it's a form of dissemination, I suppose.
Yeah.
Which of course is interesting when you think of things like change management and so on, the way in which you have this sort of ripple effect, I suppose, that in one course a pebble is dropped into the pool, and then you get the ripples which
comes out. And I'm quite sure that there are people who have done something in their own organizations which sort of via me came to their attention, but wasn't from me. It came from one of their predecessors on the course. It got passed through me to them, which is quite fun. Do you have any memories of any other courses and any other kind of anything that really struck you about? Because we've done courses together in Brisbane, in Brattleboro, in Brazil, in Da Nang, in Barcelona.
Yes. Well, I suppose when I think yeah, I think the first courses were quite memorable, and because they were early days, we were kind of feeling our way. You know, that it was, everybody was sort of learning. I think obviously I recall the Brazil courses. I mean, we were running in two huge organizations, and which were, had a very strong management structure. And I'm still in contact with one or two people from those courses. Those were quite, I suppose, partly also the setting was quite memorable. After all, running a course in Rio when we were staying on Copacabana and all of that sort of thing, that's fairly memorable. And then the Vietnam courses, which were also quite, I mean, they were very different. I mean, if you think of running the courses at ICT in Brisbane, where you were inside a particular organisation. Brisbane itself is a kind of easy place to be located in, and so on. And whereas in Vietnam, we were in we were in the foreign scene. It was, and all of the participants, it was their country, as it were. I mean, if you think of most of the other courses, other than, say, Brazil, the participants had come from a diverse range of countries to the centre, wherever it was being held, Barcelona or SIT or Brisbane. Whereas in Vietnam, we were actually working in the place where all of our participants came from. It was in their territory, as it were. And I think that was quite interesting in itself. And we were also learning quite a lot about the way they operated, particularly within universities, and the kind of political background to their work, or the constraints under which they were working. And also there were some really nice people. Very struck by the ability and hard work of Vietnam participants. They're often having to juggle several balls in the air at once, because they would be receiving messages from their office or from their workplace, as well as having to be students and so on. It was that in itself was something which is rather different from when we were working in places like Brisbane. So and I particularly remember the last course we worked together on in Vietnam, which wasn't actually Iddleton. If you remember, it was the project.
Yes, I do remember that one very well.
and I was ill.
And I was ill too. We both got ill, because it was it was like an incredibly intense.
It was very demanding. Yeah,
it was massive. It was a huge amount of work.
But it was very interesting. And I was really impressed by all the people that one was working with there, and learning a lot about how they were operating within the university system there. No, I think it was the whole thing from beginning to end was, I think, in a way, kind of, for me, it was sort of the end of my career, because most of the work I did was after I retired. I mean, it was a brilliant thing to have that sort of land in my lap as I left CALS and took this up. I mean, it was just fantastic, because it gave me something interesting to deal with after I'd retired. And it also meant that the other things I was doing, like I was a governor of the Bell Language School, Bell Educational, whatever it's called now, Bell Language Schools. Educational Trust. Educational Trust. That also was, and I had other things that I was involved with. But that also kind of fed into Iddleton as well. And when I ceased being a Bell governor, which one had to do because they had an age ceiling on governorship. And in fact, it seemed to me that there are lots of organisations where an age ceiling might be appropriate, including Parliament. Anyway, so I retired from being a Bell governor, but being a Bell governor gave me kept me in touch, I think, with at least one part of the industry as active, business, and all of the problems that arise. Because when you're when you're a governor, you're dealing at regular intervals throughout the year, meetings with a whole range of issues that come up upon which decisions have to be made. I mean, these are not obviously sort of day-to-day operational decisions, but they're much more tactical and strategic. I remember one of the things that cropped up, which was really serious, was the pension scheme. Now, a lot of language schools, of course, don't have pension schemes, probably the majority don't. But Bell, from its foundation, it had a pension scheme, and it had ended up, as indeed a lot of pension schemes did at that point, in deficit. So that represented a major financial challenge to the organisation. Now, that's the sort of thing that I thought was very useful in sort of feeding into Iddleton, because you need to be aware of the way things are happening, of external factors that are impinging on the way an organisation is running, and the problems that it presents, and so on. So anyway, when I retired from Bell, there came a point where I felt I was becoming sort of out of touch with the industry. I think you need to have some kind of not a day-to-day being in touch, but you need still to be in communication with the way things are going, with the problems that are arising, the way the market's changing, for example, the impact of for example, changes in your catchment countries and so on. So there came a point where I felt it was time to quit. And I think that's because I believe you should always leave the party when it's still fun. And so I, with regret, obviously, because it was, after 10, I think I was involved for about 10 years, was it? Probably about 10.
I guess it was probably about 10, or maybe 11 or 12, I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, it had been an important part of one's professional life. And it was with some regret that I departed, but I felt it was important to do so. Particularly, it's like any performer in a way, because you are also performing, but also you've got to keep up to date with your field and be in touch with relevance and so on. And I thought it's best to quit before people kind of ask you to quit. Or you pick up gossip, where it's obvious people are saying, "Oh, it's a bit past it, time he moved on," And so I sort of felt I left it at a good high point for me and for Iddleton, because it's continued under your great care for another 10 years or so.
When we've had it in a number of countries that you won't have been involved in. We've done course in Turkey, in Oman, in China, as well as again carrying on. As well as carrying on doing courses in Brisbane and actually other cities in Australia. We've done it in Sydney and Melbourne too, and in Vietnam, not just in Da Nang. We've done it in Ho Chi Minh City as well now. So yeah, I mean it's grown, and then there was a period a few years ago we were doing 5 or 6 courses a year, which was was huge for the course. The last
Well,
2 or
that's
3
a
years it's been down to sort of 2, but
yeah, but 5 or 6 courses a year. I mean, that's a full-time job.
well, it really kind of was.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, yeah. Well, I'm glad I left before you. I mean, I found the number of courses we were doing, what would be 2 or 3 at most a year.
Yeah,
that was just right.
just about right. Yeah, I think from the perspective of the trainer perspective, yes.
Yeah.
That right, yeah.
And I mean, that was more or less most of what I was doing, whereas for you and for others, that you had other commitments. So, gosh, I just can't imagine doing 5 or 6 courses a year.
It was only a couple of years that I think we got that high.
Yeah, but even so,
it was quite a lot.
Yeah. So
okay, I'm gonna stop the recording now. That was great. It was really great having this conversation, and I hope that anyone who's watched to this point enjoyed watching it as well.